Okay, so I'm going to give you fair warning, first of all, that last time I was here in 2014, I spoke for 25 to 30 minutes, and I thought that was going to be that story this time. And I was told by Cliff, my friend here, that, this is Jeff, but Cliff, no, I should talk longer than that. I can even prove it in an email. Anyhow, I'm now convinced that I have a talk that's too long, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave out the introductory kinds of stuff and just tell you this. I love being at this library, okay? And I can tell you that, and one of the proofs of that is if you look in the dedication of the FDR on democracy, you will see that it is dedicated to key people who introduced me to the library, worked with me at the library, and welcomed me at the library, one of whom is actually sitting here in the room today, Steve, who's going to be speaking later on his medical history book regarding FDR. But let me just tell you where we're going so you have some idea. I had always believed that FDR was a progressive and a liberal, and when I worked on FDR and the Greatest Generation, and especially the more I dug into FDR and his ideas, reality, of course, is he was president. There's only so much you can do. In spite of the fact he did a hell of a lot, it's only so much you ultimately can do. I came to see FDR in terms of his time, and I'm reminded all the more in light of our time that he was a social democrat and a radical, okay? Maybe not a radical in the likes of a Mother Jones or my childhood hero Thomas Paine, but decidedly, in political terms, a radical. So I'm going to be speaking about his political development from progressive to liberal to social democrat, and how in a very American way he was in fact, or indeed, a radical. So I'll start, I'll leave out all the other stuff that I was going to say and just start. On the evening of October 31st, 1932, 3 years into the ever-deepening Great Depression, with the November elections just days away, incumbent President Herbert Hoover, a conservative Republican who was firmly committed to laissez-faire government and who had repeatedly insisted that the economy would right itself, told a crowd of 22,000 at Madison Square Garden, "This campaign is more than a contest between two men. It is more than a contest between two parties. It is a contest between two philosophies of government." And he went on to portray his Democratic opponent, Franklin Roosevelt, as a dangerous radical who was, he said, proposing changes and so-called New Deals which would destroy the very foundations of the American system of life. Was Hoover serious? Roosevelt's life and career clearly spoke of the establishment, not radicalism. The only child of Hudson Valley aristocrats, educated at Groton, Harvard, and Columbia University Law School, closely related to none other than Teddy Roosevelt, both on his own and, of course, by marrying TR's niece, Eleanor, FDR had practiced corporate law, served as a New York State senator, Undersecretary of the Navy in the Wilson administration during World War I, Democratic candidate for president in 1920, and governor of New York twice. Doesn't sound like a radical. But Hoover was not just serious, he was also right. By 1932, Roosevelt had become a radical, and his promised New Deal was definitely intended to undo what the corporate elite and political conservatives both reverentially called the American system of life and earnestly celebrated as the pinnacle of American progress. As FDR saw it, that so-called American system, that persistent Gilded Age order with its ever-growing extremes of rich and poor and ever-intensifying concentration of wealth and power, presented the foremost danger to a more fundamental America. That is, the America the founders had envisioned as a grand experiment in self-government and which generations of men and women, both native-born and newly arrived, had endeavored to make ever freer, more equal, and more democratic. And now that very system celebrated by Hoover and the establishment had brought about not only the worst economic and social catastrophe in the nation's history, but also by failing to respond to the needs and demands of the tens of millions devastated by it, the real possibility of an authoritarian revolution that would destroy American democracy altogether. And I could list all the places where, like Vanity Fair, that thought maybe a Mussolini would be a good thing for America in 1932. By 1932, Roosevelt had come to see that the only way to save American democratic life and its promise was to do what earlier generations had done in the 1770s and the 1860s when the United States faced a mortal crisis, and that was to radically enhance it. And given the demonstrations, marches, and protests by workers, farmers, students, and veterans, he believed most Americans were seeing the very same thing. Now, critically, FDR, unlike so many of his class, did not fear America's democratic impulses. Rather, with fascist Italy and communist Russia in mind, he feared what might happen if they were too long thwarted. As early as 1926, well before the Depression struck, he told the students up in Boston at Milton Academy, "Our national danger is not that the United States may for 4 or 8 years become liberal or even radical, but that it may suffer from too long a period of the do-nothing or reactionary standards." And even more pointedly, in May 1930, less than a year into the Depression, Roosevelt wrote to his friend John Kingsbury, a leading authority on social welfare, and said, quote, "There is no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for at least one generation. History shows that where this occurs occasionally, nations are saved from revolution." And keep in mind, revolution at that moment meant either fascism or communism. Of course, Hoover didn't know about that letter, but he definitely knew that FDR was promising radical changes, as Roosevelt laid it out on the campaign trail. For some reason, historians think FDR didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do. His administration, he said, would seek to oversee financial transactions, institute economic planning, raise workers' and farmers' purchasing power, create a more equitable distribution of income and wealth, develop a system of old age insurance, and launch public works projects to provide jobs, rebuild the nation's public infrastructure, and rehabilitate the environment. And if all that did not drive Hoover and his ilk up the proverbial wall, FDR's speech accepting the Democratic nomination surely did. Titling his platform "The New Deal," he advanced one of the most radical arguments in modern history, as radical as Karl Marx, an argument we ourselves should never forget. His words, "Our Republican leaders tell us that economic laws, sacred, inviolable, unchangeable, cause panics which no one could prevent. But while they prate of economic laws, men and women are starving." And listen to this, he says, "We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature. They are made by human beings. You cannot get more radical in 20th century or 21st century America than that." And when he became president in 1933, he and his New Dealers moved swiftly in those legendary first 100 days to create a host of new initiatives, such as the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and to enact laws like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the latter of which notably included the first federal minimum wage. But that wasn't the radical part. The radical part was said maybe under his breath, but some heard him. He said, "No business that pays less than a living wage has any right to operate in this country." No business that pays less than a living wage has any right to operate in this country. When's the last time you heard any president? All of which was you never even heard Bernie Sanders say that. All of which was intended to encourage, empower, and mobilize Americans to not merely fight the Depression, but also make the nation fairly radical for at least a generation. Ever a Democrat, FDR was never simply a Democrat. He began his career in the 19-teens by aligning himself with the then-ascendant politics of progressivism. But that ascendance ended in 1920 when the GOP won both the White House and Congress, and the corporate and conservative powers reasserted themselves. And yet, even after suffering political defeat in 1920 and polio the following year, Roosevelt, aided by his chief political advisor, Lewis Howe, and his wife, Eleanor, remained active in the party, even if it was, from his own estate. Indeed, he set himself not just to recovering from that defeat and the disease that had placed him in a wheelchair, but also to developing a new liberal politics to more effectively challenge the Republicans and the plutocrats who now governed America anew. Moreover, he kept moving. And by decade's end, he became not only the most vibrant political figure in the country, but also when confronting the Great Depression, first as governor and then as president, in his words, a militant liberal, or as I would say, a social democrat and a radical. And yet his fundamental political beliefs, his ideals, and his aspirations never really changed. What changed were the circumstances he faced in trying to realize them. Now, FDR was a man of faith, and his faith definitely shaped his politics. But in the broadest sense, his political thinking and actions emanated from his profoundly democratic understanding of American history. Very much like those of Abraham Lincoln, who famously said in Philadelphia on his way to his first inauguration in 1861, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." So too, FDR's politics were deeply rooted in and continually nourished by the revolutionary promise of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a government of we the people. And even more than Lincoln, maybe because there was that much more history he could reflect on, even more than Lincoln, by the struggles of generations to secure that promise and enlarge both the we and we the people and the powers of the people. To Roosevelt, American democratic life was a persistent, perpetual revolution. Or as he said in 1935, democracy is not a static thing, it is an everlasting march. And that history instilled in him not just a powerful faith and confidence in America and the democratic capacities of his fellow citizens, but also an instinctive antipathy to those who would declare that the revolution was over and done, that its ideals had been achieved, that its promise was realized. It also imbued in him a powerful drive to contribute to that history. Roosevelt knew American history, his good friend Frank Kingdon, prominent educator, recalled. But what struck Kingdon even more was that FDR recognized himself as an instrument through which the forces of the past were channeled into the present and turned toward the future. American history, Kingdon said, was alive in him. Still others recalled that as much as Roosevelt was always eager to find out what Americans were thinking, he actually imagined them possessing the very same democratic memories, impulses, and longings that he did. Memories, impulses, and longings he would continually seek to engage for democratic political action. And leftist writer Max Lerner, who's one of my heroes in literary terms, predicted in 1938 that FDR will be remembered as a man who, without being of the people, was able to grasp and to some degree communicate what the common man felt. Many have speculated on the origins of Roosevelt's ideas and allegiances, but we should not fail to appreciate that from the very outset, as a young state senator, FDR sought to identify himself with the democratic currents that ran through American history. In a 1912 speech to the People's Forum in Troy, New York, he argued that although the struggle for representative government and liberty of the individual was essentially accomplished, and obviously a grossly exaggerated assertion, okay, undeniably, but he went on and he said, "A new struggle has begun, a struggle for liberty of the community, a struggle against the Gilded Age order pursued by populists, socialists, and progressives, which FDR thought the founders themselves would have embraced. To state it plainly," FDR said, "competition has been shown to be useful up to a certain point, but cooperation, which is the thing we must strive for today, begins where competition leaves off. And this is what the founders of the Republic were groping for." Now, knowing Roosevelt from his days as a state senator and then by serving as his industrial commissioner here in New York, Secretary of Labor in Washington, Frances Perkins, the first female cabinet officer ever, offered what would become the most moving explanation. Now, she recalled a man who had little, if any, concern about social reforms and a deafness to the hopes, fears, and aspirations which are the common lot. But she said he matured as Assistant Secretary of the Navy when he had to deal with labor unions and workers in the shipyards. But of course, she said, the real change came in his battle with polio. The man emerged completely warm-hearted, with humility of spirit and with a deeper philosophy. Having been to the depths of trouble, he understood the problems of people and showed he had developed faith in the capacity of troubled people to respond to help and encouragement. It humanized him. But there's something else. What also happened in the 20s is that he received a continuing education from the left and from the bottom up, dispersed by the increasingly progressive Eleanor. Now, Eleanor had become active in the Women's Trade Union League, which is a combination of well-to-do women and women labor organizers. And she introduced FDR to, this is a long thing to read, immigrant, socialist, Jewish women labor organizers, from whom he learned all the more about the demands and struggles of working class life. And that clearly informed his development of a new liberal, indeed social democratic politics. Now, here's where I'll give you the theory part. A politics that saw government not just regulating capital and protecting Americans from marketplace and workplace abuses, but also empowering them to realize economic security and independence, or in the words of the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, promoting the general welfare. One to say, well, what's the difference between a progressive, a liberal, and a social democrat? The progressives of the early 20th century wanted to regulate business. Liberals were eager, basically, to take the protective element of progressivism and expand it into certain kinds of what we would call social welfare programs. The social democrat takes the social welfare programs but adds an important ingredient to it, which Robert Wagner helped push FDR towards, and that is the empowerment of working people by way of labor unions and a voice in the workplace and the marketplace. In those same years, FDR also came to see how he might more effectively speak to Americans' political anxieties and yearnings, how he could encourage their political hopes and aspirations, and harness these energies for democratic action. His failed 1920 bid for the vice presidency had shown him that political struggle necessarily entails a struggle over the meaning and making of America. When Republicans questioned his and his presidential running mates' Americanism in calling for the United States to join Wilson's League of Nations, Roosevelt retorted that his opponents were trying to, quote, take out an exclusive patent on the American flag and all the great accomplishments of our history. More positively, FDR set out to write a new history of the United States because existing histories did not make it clear that the country was going somewhere right from the start. And though FDR soon discovered that in contrast to his political models, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, that he himself was not a writing man, he would not allow it to deter him from seeking other ways of cultivating a more compelling and promising American narrative, a narrative of a nation made great by the democratic impulses and initiatives of its own people. For example, speaking in Green Bay, Wisconsin, I loved coming across this because I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Speaking in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1934, just 60 miles north of the Kohler plant near Sheboygan, where a bloody strike was underway for union recognition, Roosevelt said, "People know that the average man in Wisconsin has waged a long and bitter fight for his rights." And then FDR made clear that the fight goes on nationally and that Americans will not retreat. That's a paraphrasing there. Moreover, he continually articulated a vision of an ever more democratic America. Each of these paragraphs is a book unto itself. First, he did so most stunningly in his September 1932 Commonwealth Club speech in San Francisco, when after charging that Gilded Age industrial capitalists had subverted the Declaration's revolutionary promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those are exactly the words he used, he urged the drafting of a new declaration, an economic declaration of rights. People forget, FDR's presidency really begins with the call for an economic declaration of rights, is highlighted by the four freedoms, and is closed, though he lives on another year and more, with the call for an economic Bill of Rights. It's always inside of that presidency. So he urged the drafting of a new economic declaration of rights and even called for a new economic constitutional order. He did so most beautifully, now move on, in his 1941 annual message to Congress, when, in the spirit of Lincoln's new birth of freedom, he pronounced the four freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, and rendered a vision of a post-war world that Americans could hope to realize. And he would do so most radically in his 1944 State of the Union address, when, standing on the shoulders of the founders and framers, he proposed nothing less than an economic Bill of Rights for all Americans, a proposal empowered by polling, which showed, this didn't spring out of his head alone, the polls showed that the vast majority of Americans at war's end wanted government to guarantee such things as a useful job at a living wage, health care, decent housing, and education for all, and I don't have the full list with me. But to give you a sense of how many Americans wanted those things, 83% of Americans basically wanted universal health care. 95% of Democrats wanted it, and 75% of Republicans wanted it. Now, and these aspirations were definitely encouraged by the promise of the Four Freedoms and by what Americans had accomplished in the New Deal and the war effort. Roosevelt never spoke nostalgically of the past, nor did he, in contrast to, say, Ronald Reagan. Roosevelt never spoke nostalgically of the past, nor did he ever use it to try to subdue Americans' democratic impulses. He was very clear about his determination to pursue not just relief and recovery, but also reconstruction and reform. That is, fairly radical reforms. At the same time, he never spoke of the New Deal as a break with America's past. In June 1934, in a message to Congress, he said, "Our task of reconstruction does not require the creation of new and strange values. It is rather the finding of the way once more to known but to some degree forgotten ideals and values." And in a fireside chat just a few weeks later, he added, "I believe that what we are doing today is a necessary fulfillment of what Americans have always been doing, a fulfillment of old and tested American ideals." I can tell you, these are the FDR speeches, alongside of Lincoln's, are the finest in American history. Unreservedly, I say that. He spoke to Americans imagining that they fully understood him. He had no doubt, I often think, that they grasped what he was saying because he was engaging them in the project. Roosevelt sought to engage Americans' memories and yearnings, to rally their spirits and energies, to encourage and empower them to confront, overcome, and beat not only the Depression, but also the order that had spawned it. He wanted them to see themselves as makers of history, engaged in transforming themselves and their nation. And by the way, if you ever get a chance, if you pick up my book or just go online, look at his Cleveland, Ohio speech of I think it was September, October 1940. It is the finest campaign speech ever delivered. It is an unbelievably powerful speech. Whenever political figures have called me to say, well, what do you think I should sound like? What should I talk about? I tell them, look at that speech. You're not president, you haven't got the New Deal behind you, but that's a reminder of who Americans are and what they can still accomplish. I brought a copy of it with me, but I knew we'd never get to it. In his Brotherhood Day radio address on February 23, 1936, he explained, "I do not look upon these United States as a finished product. We are still in the making." And he always made clear the direction. This, to me, was one of the most phenomenal of his sentences, given where he delivered it. He's dedicating a World War memorial in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1936. Listen to what he says. This is a war memorial. Quote, "A true patriotism urges us to build an even more substantial America, where the good things of life may be shared by more of us, where the social injustices will not be encouraged to flourish." He's not going on celebrating heroism in battle. He's talking about what America must do. Naturally, laws, policies, and programs to regulate capital, tax millionaires and their corporations, and empower workers and farmers seriously antagonized the rich and the right. Just imagine what they thought when FDR signed the NIRA into law, that sentence where I said that no business should be allowed to operate. And in 1934, he actually asked Congress to set limits to the accumulation of wealth. I'd love to hear a president do that. Hoping to put a halt to the New Deal by making FDR a one-term president, the richest men in the country organized. Are you telling me I have 5 minutes? I'm going to have to ignore you, okay? Sorry. Hoping to put a halt to the New Deal, they organized the American Liberty League. They spent vast sums of money producing books and pamphlets, radio broadcasts, film strips, accusing him, portraying him as a communist or a socialist. They even, off the record, were encouraging the creation of a third party at that time, and I would love to get into explaining that, but I don't have time, apparently. FDR was no communist, he was no socialist. He did not envision nationalizing banks or industries. He believed firmly what Lincoln believed, that government does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. FDR, as president, became more than a progressive, more than a liberal. He became a social democrat. Think about it this way. He engages Americans in he's creating a veritable alphabet soup of agencies to fight the Depression and empower people. Millions of Americans in all their diversity were doing the same thing. United Mine Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, in other words, the UMW, the ILGW, the UAW, the CIO, the AYC, American Youth Congress, the NNC, the National Negro Congress. I mean, over and over again, this is president and people in this kind of fascinating democratic dialectic. Now, again, conservative politicians and corporate bosses did not want more democracy, especially not social and industrial democracy. But we know the American people did. They gave Democrats even more seats in Congress than 34. In 1935, literally, when the Democrats gained ever more power in Washington, FDR announces a second New Deal, new public works projects, new programs. I'm compacting a hell of a lot of good stuff here. Here's the thing. In 1936, FDR, he's going to really go all out. In a message to Congress, his what we would now call State of the Union, he literally lumps together America's corporate reactionaries and European fascists as essentially the same authoritarian, as having the same authoritarian ambitions. And he says, within democratic nations, the chief concern of the people is to prevent the continuance or the rise of autocratic institutions. Within our borders, as in the world at large, popular opinion is at war with a power-seeking minority. But the best speech, in all these speeches, and there's so many great speeches, in 1936, when he's accepting the Democratic nomination in Philadelphia, and it's framed by the idea of the American Revolution. He takes a personal hand in composing the platform that year, which is laid out in the form of the Declaration. And in that speech, of course, is where he then famously compares the industrial capitalists of the 30s to the royalists of the American Revolution, who we were fighting against, and the Tories. And he's got this, think of this, 100,000 people in a stadium, and he says, these economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. That paragraph of his is without question the single most radical paragraph ever said by a sitting, standing, however you want to look at it, President of the United States. Okay? It is an incredibly challenging statement. And he calls for a democracy of opportunity. I mean, I could go on and on, but I want to there's one more thing I want to do because I'm running out of time, okay? I want to remind everyone exactly what the New Deal involved. Revolutionary changes. President and people subjected business and banking to public account and regulation. They empowered government to address the needs of working people and the poor. They organized labor unions, consumer campaigns, and civil rights groups to fight for their rights and make we the people meaningful. They established a social security system. They built schools, libraries, hospitals, post offices, and parks. They vastly expanded the nation's public infrastructure with new roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, and dams. They dramatically improved the American landscape and environment, and they energetically cultivated the arts and refashioned popular culture. Just think swing music. Yeah, a hell of a lot remained to be done, but they had imbued themselves with fresh democratic convictions, hopes, and aspirations. And when their rendezvous with destiny had arrived, when Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan threatened to destroy the United States and bury its democratic promise, they did not stop. Some people even call the war effort the Third New Deal. They went out both at home and overseas. They subjected the economy to even greater public control. They continued to dramatically expand labor, consumer, and civil rights movements. They further transformed the we and we the people. They reduced poverty and inequality from the bottom up. And they embraced the prospect of radically enhancing American democratic life by securing an economic Bill of Rights. In light of our own crisis of democracy, I will close with FDR's warning on the eve of the 1938 midterm elections. As of today, fascism and communism and old-line Tory republicanism are not threats to the continuation of our form of government. But I venture the challenging statement that if American democracy ceases to move forward as a living force, seeking day and night by peaceful means to better the lot of our citizens, then fascism and communism, aided unconsciously perhaps by old-line Tory republicanism, will grow in strength in our land. All of which, my words, is to say that we too need to make America fairly radical for at least a generation, okay? Now, I've left out a lot of stuff. I've ignored his sins and his faults and failings. I'm not oblivious to them. But if you, I think I actually left myself 10 minutes if you want to take advantage of them. Okay. Okay, thanks. Happy to take any questions. Yes?
Thank you for a terrific talk, and I was definitely persuaded by your argument, and I particularly like the attention to the social unionism of the WQL and that moment. But I'm going to ask a sort of the obvious question.
Okay.
And is that there's been this very radical debate about how to look with the New Deal now for, as the New Deal, back and forth, back and forth. And so I'm just wondering how you would respond to the opposite side, particularly around the issue of race, in terms of how that perhaps challenges your analysis of the speech.
Yeah, and I'm decidedly conscious of that, and I can tell you what I left out was the Jewish refugee question, Jim Crow, and the internment of Japanese Americans, okay? And let's be clear, if there's a St. Peter, he's got a hell of a lot to answer for, okay? But that's not the point. I think, this is what I think, okay? I think he could, if we look closely at the New Deal itself, okay? The New Deal is, the racism of the New Deal is not FDR. The racism of the New Deal is the power of Southern Democrats in Washington. I mean, they chaired all the committees, so that if a bill came forward, they're the ones who literally transformed the bill to exclude household workers and agricultural workers who are Black and Mexican Americans in the Southwest. And when it came to World War II, if many of the generals had had their way, there wouldn't even have been Black regiments in the Army. I mean, I think that my argument is this, that these are all terrible faults and failings, really tragic faults and failings. But I think if one considers what was actually accomplished, okay, and in the face of those kinds of oppositions, that this was still a radical change from all presidential administrations before it. However, I would not call FDR a radical on race, okay, or necessarily on gender, or decidedly on how he handled the question of Jewish refugees. But also, I must be clear, Robert Wagner, the senator of New York, who was a German American, born in Germany, in fact, himself sought to change the refugee, my reading is, and could not bring a change in the refugees. The decisions made were terrible. FDR's biggest flaw on the refugee question had to do with his failure to purge the State Department, okay? His biggest flaws on race is that in fact, Eleanor was going to do it for him, basically, okay, when she went south. And Wallace would do it for him, and Wilkie would do it for him during the war as the question arose. But I will also point out, and we don't often realize this, that in 1944, in October of 44, FDR called for extending the right to vote, to make sure that everyone had the right to vote in the United States. He actually called exactly for that in a speech, not long after he reiterated the Economic Bill of Rights. So I absolutely, am not, my best friend, who's now passed away, was born in an internment camp, okay? I mean, I'm fully aware of the flaws, but if I see him in terms of his historical moment and what was accomplished, I still see him as a radical. That's the best I can do, I guess. Yeah.
It seems to me that Roosevelt almost always spoke in first person plural, whereas Reagan began to speak of government in the third person, singular and plural. I wonder, has anybody done a linguistic analysis of their speeches? Because of course, to speak in the third person is totally corrosive to the whole idea of democracy.
Okay, the best thing I can do is I'm sure someone has, and I've failed to. There's a, so this is this speech in Cleveland in 1940, okay? And he starts off, he's responding in part to Anne Morrow Lindbergh's book, The Wave of the Future, Fascism, okay? And we know about Lindbergh, we don't need to go there right now. So FDR begins a speech talking about the fact that basically the book of democracy is not yet closed and we can be its authors. And then he goes on and it's very, very interesting. He says, Your government assumed its proper, he says, the start toward a solution to these problems had to be made 7 years ago. Your government assumed its proper function as the working representative. You provided work for free men and women. You used the powers of government. You wrote into the law. You turned to the problems of youth and age. You advanced to other objectives, and it goes on and on and on. Later, he says, of course we will not turn backward. We will not turn back because we are the inheritors of a tradition. Of course we shall continue. Of course we shall continue. And it's over and over again, this kind of thing. Now, all I can tell you is that's the speech that I think is the most unbelievable campaign speech. He tells Americans, America is about democracy. Look at what we have accomplished, you have accomplished, okay? It doesn't even include the I form there. Because sorry, it says, he starts off with an I or two in the beginning, then he shifts to the U form. And then he's literally projecting, and if I could read all of that, I would. He is laying out the most small d democratic, social democratic vision of a late 20th century imaginable. I've never heard any other president speak like that. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Happily take anything. Oh, Donna made the tail end?
As you spoke,
Sorry, yeah.
I'm reminded of the days of the Congress, especially the last concluding lines. Did he explicitly reference Lincoln in his speeches?
Regularly. There have been articles way back, done quite a while ago, about how in the 30s, Jefferson was his primary reference, okay? But I have to tell you, around 1930, there was an American historian, one of you will correct me, Claude Barrows, something like that, okay? University of Virginia. He was a Jeffersonian scholar. And he was also the leading intellectual, it was said, in the Democratic Party at that time. And he and Roosevelt were in constant contact. And Roosevelt sends him a letter, and this, I guess, is around the time the Lincoln Memorial was it just dedicated or was soon to be dedicated? And he says, the Republicans have basically abandoned Lincoln. I think it's time we make him one of our own. And in the 30s, he does make reference to Lincoln, but much more so to Jefferson. He literally orders, like, the Jefferson nickel, and all, he wants it all over the place. The Jefferson Memorial, it's going to be big, Jefferson. Because he actually talks in an article in the 1920s that he wrote for one of the New York papers, that he says, it's about the Hamilton-Jefferson battle through history, and he says, do we see a Jefferson on the horizon today? And I'm sure he's talking about himself at that moment. But then, as the war is approaching, and during the war, it's Lincoln. It's Lincoln, and it's the best example I can give you of the mood of the times is Aaron Copland, who does the what's it called, the Lincoln portrait, right? When he was first offered the commission, he was going to write possibly that and another one, which became Fanfare of the Common Man. He was going to call it Fanfare for the Four Freedoms. So this is all running through people's heads. And he does Lincoln at that moment. So here's FDR, and it's first performed, I think, in Washington. I could be wrong. And undeniably, Lincoln is now becoming the theme for the Roosevelt presidency. And even when he gives even before that, I have little doubt that when he gave the Four Freedoms speech, that he has Lincoln in his head. I mean, as I said in my Four Freedoms book, it's echoing the Declaration and the Gettysburg Address to do that. So yeah, Lincoln becomes very important in all of that, especially late 30s into the war years. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Yeah. Also, I said, if I don't have another questions, one last thing I'll tell you, and then we should go. I was just going to tell you that I so love this place, and every time I've ever come here to work, I do something that I bet other historians do this, so maybe it doesn't have to be in the form of a confession. But when I ask for papers to be delivered to the table I'm working at, the papers come, and I pick them up, and I do something which archivists should shoot me for doing, but I rub my hand across the pages, thinking maybe there's some little micro speck of FDR's DNA still left on there that I can pick up. So I do, whenever I come here, I just feel like I'm that much closer to FDR. And thank you for coming this morning, and terrible weather.